September 20th, 1942. North Island Naval Air Station, San Diego in California. Officer First Class Eddie Sanders held the plane's control stick. Those things shouldn't be in American hands. Even though it was cool off the Pacific in the morning, his hands were sweating. The characters in Japanese were shown on the control panel in front of him. The controls didn't feel right. The whole cockpit smelled bad. Lots of oil and strange things. Armed guards stood outside the windshield, surrounded the hangar, their orders clear since the valuable cargo had already arrived 3 weeks ago. This was the most. Sanders was about to fly the most expensive plane in the world for the first time. He let go of the brakes on the Mitsubishi A6M2 Model 2110 fighter, and it rolled forward with its engine running, purring in a smooth way that surprises me. Within minutes, this one test flight would show flaws that would change the way American fighters fight and end Japan's air superiority. The codes inside this stolen machine could be used to make a weapon that could kill over 5,000 enemies, destroy enemy ships, and turn the tide of the Pacific War. Not this flight, but 5 months before, the change had started. On June 4th, 1942, a young Japanese pilot made his last landing on an island in the inland sea that was soaked with rain. At the same time, American dive bombers were destroying 4 Japanese aircraft ships 300 to the east at the Battle of Midway, which changed the course of the Pacific War for good. A smaller one lives in Alaska's Aleutian Islands, though. There was drama going on that would also change things. Flight Petty Officer 19 years old. From the Ryujo carrier, First Class Tadayoshi Koga launched his Zero fighter. An attack meant to draw attention away from the American base at Dutch Harbor. The task in the morning went as planned. At first, Koga and his sidekicks, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tugo Shikard attacked Dutch Harbor and did a lot of damage by shooting. They shot down an American PBY Catalina patrol plane and hit survivors in the water. The Zero did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was faster and easier to control. Better than anything the U.S. could put together. Then one bullet changed everything. Ground fire from Dutch Harbor, most likely from a .50 caliber machine gun, hit Koga's plane and cut off the oil return line. If you didn't lubricate an engine properly, this could kill it. The broken line started to spray oil, and Koga knew he had about 15 minutes before the whole engine stopped working. He told his flight captain about the damage over the radio and then toured Akutan Island, which is 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor and was named by the Japanese as a place to stop in case of an emergency. A submarine waited out at sea to help, taking off pilots. As Koga got closer to Akutan Island, he saw what looked like a long, flat grassy area about a half-mile long would make a great emergency landing field, away from Broadbite. As Koga got closer, his wingman flew around above him. For what should have been a simple wheels-down landing, the landing gear expanded. Shikard, flying above, all of a sudden. On his second pass, he saw water shimmering between the grass blades. He was horrified to see that the field was actually a bog, and the grass covered up knee-deep mud and water that wasn't moving. It was too late to send out a radio alert. Koga had already promised to do his. Coming in, the Zero's wheels hit the ground at about 80 miles per hour. For a short time, it looked like the landing went well. The main gear then went into the soft mud under the plants, catching with a lot of force. Physics took over. The light fighter, with its tail still moving at the speed of landing, violently cartwheeled over and over again. The plane flipped over, down into the bog with a force that breaks bones. Koga was killed before he could fight back when the force snapped his neck. Take a deep breath in. In the upside-down cabin, his body stayed in place thanks to his seat belt. He still had his service gun and samurai sword around his waist, and his flight suit was still spotless, except for the exact. Because of past accidents, medical tape was wrapped around his middle. The guys who worked for Koga faced him. Choosing was very hard. They were told on a regular basis to destroy any crippled Zero so it doesn't get into the hands of the enemy. They went around the crash spot several times, with their machine guns ready. They looked for any sign that their friend had survived. The plane looked like they were still whole, lying on their backs in the water like a turtle, and they couldn't bring themselves to fire. Koga might have been living but stuck and waiting to be freed. They couldn't kill their friend just in case he might make it. After a few more passes, their fuel was getting low, so they reluctantly turned around west and went back to the Ryujo. The submarine sent to help went down. Pilots looked for hours in the water around Akutan before the USS Williamson, an American warship, pushed it away. Koga's. He and his Zero stayed alone in the Aleutian Desert, which is 5,000 miles away from Japan. They are ready to tell anyone the secrets of the Empire's most dangerous weapon. 5. Koga's Zero sat in the Yakutan bog for weeks without being moved. The layout of the crash site. Out of sight of normal shipping lines and air patrol routes, in a small valley that got about 6 days of. Through the constant Aleutian fog, there is 1 month of clear sight. The forces on the aircraft carrier that might have been looking for Koga, who had already moved west after the terrible loss at Midway. The pilot's death was another loss in a war that was quickly turning against Japan. Then in July, on February 10, 1942, an American PBY Catalina patrol plane flown by Lieutenant William lost his way. It was dangerous to get around in the lies, with. Near the Arctic Circle, magnetic compasses don't work well, and features are hard to see. Almost always fog. When Thies saw the Shumagen, he was still using dead reckoning to find his way. Isles through a hole in the clouds. When he realized where he was, he changed his direction to go to Dutch Harbor and chose to fly. To save time and fuel, they flew straight over Akutan Island instead of going around it. As the plane's captain, Albert Knack, a machinist mate, happened to look down. In the exact right moment, he saw through a brief hole in the fog. There was a strange shape in the marsh below that didn't fit in the illusionist landscape. The bright red. It was easy to see the rings on the wings. Thies went around the spot several times, taking careful notes on his charts about the position. The Zero looked amazingly whole, which was an unbelievable win. He went back to Dutch Harbor right away to tell everyone about the find. Within hours, a rescue team arrived near the crash site. What they found was even better than they had hoped. It looked like the Zero had arrived in maybe the only. There was a place on Akutan Island where the bog was soft enough to absorb the shock, but hard enough to stop the planes from going down. The marsh had been like a big shock absorber, letting go of the force that would have broke the frame of the plane on stable ground. Besides a broken windshield, the plane had broken wing tips, broken propeller tips, and broken landing gear. Fundamentally whole. The rescue team took Koga's body out of the cockpit with care and buried him with military honors. Honors were given on a hillside with a view of the crash site. They saw that he had a lot of medical tape around his chest, that there have been past injuries or safety steps against high-speed maneuvers. His private life, his weapons and effects, like his pistol and sword, were taken away as intelligence information. Then the difficult job of getting a fighter plane out of an Aleutian bog started. The healing process took almost 3 weeks of hard work in some of the worst weather on Earth. Workers put together make a road out of logs and planks, slowly pulling the trapped fighter across a half-mile of dangerous terrain to a wide bight where it could be put on a boat. The whole operation went ahead in constant, damp cold with tools that froze or rusted overnight, but the prize was worth it. Hard times. By the end of July, the Zero had been put on a cargo ship and sent to the United States. The ship with history's most important captured plane left the Illusions in early August, sailing south through seas that had been fought over by both Japanese and American forces just a few weeks before. Fleets. The Zero that was caught got to Seattle on August 1st, 1942. They were put on a boat right away and taken to Naval Air Station North Island, which is near San Diego. The airplane. It got to San Diego in the middle of August and was unloaded under close guard before being moved to a safe hangar. 24 hours of military. Police security made sure that no souvenir hunters could hurt the priceless prize. The news of the arrest spread through Navy aircraft circles quite excitedly. For the first time since the Zeros. After its devastating launch at Pearl Harbor, American pilots and engineers would have the chance to look at the fighter in great detail. Captain William Leonard of the Navy, who would later lead a carrier group in the Pacific, called. It was a prize that hit a lot of things at a time when people really needed them. Marine Colonel First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who would live through the war and become an ace with 21 kills, would later say that studying Koga's plane helped him figure out what to do when he had a Zero on his tail, which saved his life. Life more than once. It was a race to get the Zero back into flying shape as soon as possible. The planes were stopped every day, which meant that American pilots had to face an enemy every day. Did not fully understand. The repair team worked non-stop, making careful notes of every detail of the plane's build while fixing the damage from the crash. The work went on with amazing speed, pushed by a sense of urgency and the belief that this one plane could be the key to victory. The Pacific Air War. The restoration gave us instant clues about how Japanese designers think about design. One engineer said that the Zero was built like a precise watch, with flush rivets all over the airframe and guns placed on the sides, flush with the sides of the wings to cut down on drag. Each part was made to meet the minimum weight and the most economy possible. The control panel was amazingly simple, with nothing extraneous on it. Distract the pilot. Only the most important readings are set up so they can be read right away. To open inspection screens, all you had to do was press on marked areas with your finger to release internal latches. A whole plane could be taken apart and put back together with only a few tools. Important benefit for field maintenance on basic island sites. The group found that the Zero weighed between 5.300 to 6.165 pounds when fully loaded. Depending on, it is about 2,000 pounds lighter than the American F4F Wildcat in terms of weight, fuel load, and design. This huge weight loss was caused by a number of different things. What the Zero lacked. The driver doesn't have armor, so they rely on their ability to move quickly to avoid getting hit. The gas tanks weren't self-sealing, giving up safety for lighter weight and more space. The plane itself used the least amount of structural material possible, just enough to hold the expected loads with no extra room for error. The Zero was made with a very different set of principles than American fighters. Where American planes land. The Zero put pilot safety and structural toughness first, sacrificing weight for survival. Gave up protection for speed. It was a fighter meant to win by being very quick, not by taking damage. Punishment. The plane that was caught revealed more secrets. The engine has 14 cylinders. Nakajima Sakai rotary engine that made about 950 horsepower and used a float-type engine that would be useful in battle. The wings pulled up for storage on the carrier using a simple. The process is manual and doesn't need any hydraulic systems. The buttons and knobs were. To keep the weight down, cloth was put over metal frames. Even more impressively, for such a light airplane, the weapons package was very strong. Two 7.7 millimeters. There are two 20 millimeters cannons on the wings and machine guns that fire through the propeller arc. On September 20th, only 41 days after getting to San Diego, the Zero was getting ready to fly. The repair team had fixed the broken windshield, made the vertical stabilizer straight, and repaired the rudder, the wing tips and flaps, and the landing gear that had been cut off and remade from scratch. In the crash, the original Sumitomo propeller with 3 blades was carefully cleaned and used again. The recovered plane was given a new color scheme. The bright red Japanese Hinamaru. Rounds with the American flag's blue circle and white star on them. It looked like an American plane dressed like a Japanese one. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders was chosen to be the chief test pilot. For the project, had spent the week before studying every part of the Zero while workers finished the fixing things. He learned about the Japanese for hours while sitting in the pilot, getting his mind ready for a flight unlike any he had ever tried. He studied the instruments and the layout of the controls. Sanders was test pilot with a lot of experience, but he was about to fly an enemy plane whose flight traits could only be guessed based on intelligence reports and observations made in battle. If what they said was true, the Zero was faster, climbed higher, and turned more sharply than any American fighter. What if those reports? Sanders might not make it through the first trip if they were wrong, or if the captured plane had damage that wasn't obvious. In the morning, Sanders got into the Zer's cockpit on September 20th, 1942, for the first time as a pilot instead of a student. Crews on the ground turned on the engine, which caught right away and worked well. The repair team's work was proven right. Sanders made his way to the runway while aware that dozens of engineers, intelligence officers, and top Navy officials were looking. From the flight line and the tower, he pushed down on the gas, and the Zero sped down the runway with surprisingly ready. The light fighter took off after a very short roll on the ground and began to climb at a fast rate. In any American plane, that would have been amazing. For the next hour, Sanders did a number of things to the Zero. Performance tests, carefully looking into the range of its flight. He went up in the air, tried the stall characteristics, performed basic moves, and got a feel for how the plane handles. Everything would change after that first flight because of what he learned. At first glance, it was clear that the ailerons, frozen up at speeds above 200 knots, which made moving very slow and required a lot of force on the stick of power. He wrote in his report, the Zero was much easier to roll to the left than to the right. The Zero's aileron problem at high speeds was dramatic and out of the blue. Japan's pilots said they were very maneuverable and could easily turn inside any American fighter. But when the speed went above 200 knots, about 230 miles per hour, the ailerons got heavier and not responding. The fabric-covered control panels blew up when the air pressure was high. American fighters with high speeds that require a lot of stick force to beat. Their control surfaces were made of metal, and their hydraulic boost systems kept full control power at all times. Sanders found a second important weakness during negative acceleration moves. When he pushed the stick forward hard, causing negative acceleration, the Zero's engine coughed and died because of gravity pull. The float-type engine is made to work in both positive and negative gravity. Fuel flow could not be kept up during extended negative acceleration. The engine would start up again when positive acceleration was applied. Even though acceleration started up again, the Zero turned into a helpless glider for a few seconds. This weakness had deep effects. Sanders quickly saw the tactical implications. American pilots, being outsmarted and unable to get away from a Zero that was chasing them, now had their answer, Sanders wrote in his report. Go into a, if possible, use negative acceleration to open the range during a vertical power dive while the Zero's engine was. Those forces stopped it. At about 200 knots, roll hard right before the pilot of the Zero could line up his targets. Sanders made 24 test flights. Over the next 25 days, each one giving more information about what the Zero can and can't do. He tried the plane at different heights, power levels, and battle positions. There were other test pilots flying F-4F Wildcats and later planes with him who put on fake dogfights against American fighters. It was amazing how much information was gathered from these trips. In spite of reports from battle, it was a little slower than the F-4F Wildcat, showing that the Japanese fighter was faster. Sanders thought this might be because reconstruction wait because the repair team couldn't find exact replacement parts for some. However, the Zer's wide range, over 1,900 statute, makes it stand out. Far more than any American ship fighter. The plane could stay in the air for a long time. It can stay in the air for more than 6 hours, so it can follow bombers deep into enemy territory or scan large areas of ocean. The Zero's rate of climb was much faster than American fighters, of getting to 20,000 feet faster than an F-4F could get to 15,000 feet. When moving slowly, the Zero could go around in a full circle in less time than it took American pilots to go around 3/4 of the way. These performance traits explained why early in the war, Japanese pilots had been so much better at fighting. The Zero was better than everything else at slow speeds and in turning battles. The United States fought in late 1941 and early 1942. The Zero's light, on the other hand, had weaknesses that Sanders was able to take advantage of. The way it was built meant it couldn't take hits in battle. Hits that would only hurt an American fighter often did so. Killed the Zero because it didn't have any armor or fuel tanks that could seal themselves. When the right field materials study of captured Zero parts were done, high-quality aluminum alloys were found, but in sizes that American designers would deem inadequate. The Zero was built with the smallest possible errors, with no safety gaps for damage from battle. Sanders' final report summed up all the test data into useful information. American pilots should stay away from slow-speed turn battles where the Zero was very maneuverable, so they should use diving strikes instead, using the fact that American boxers are better at going fast. When an enemy Zero came after them, American pilots should go into a steep dive, ideally with negative acceleration, to kill the engine of the Zero, then do a hard right roll at high speed where the Zero could do not follow. American soldiers should use their better weapons and protection too. It should take hits and then launch devastating bursts that would destroy the Zero. Team methods should be used instead. Individual dog fights with wingmen protecting each other and working together to counter the Zeros. Turning edge. These suggestions were put together and sent out to the whole fleet at a speed that had never been seen before. Pilots getting ready for battle were given thorough briefings on the Zero's features and how to use them to their advantage. Weaknesses. The knowledge was used to help teachers with training programs, showing every new pilot how to do the high-speed dive and hard right roll. Veterans who had survived early Zeros. They suddenly knew what they were up against and how to win. This had an effect on the captain. High confidence. For 8 months, American naval pilots had been in a battle that they flew planes that seemed unbeatable and could turn and climb higher than anything else. Pilots had grown to really value the Zero, almost to the point of fear it, and when it was jumped by, Zeros had been to just run away, which was an embarrassing admission of being bad. American pilots knew how to fight the Zero and win for the first time. The walls around the Japanese fighter started to fall apart. It was still a strong opponent, but not as strong as it used to be. Not unbeatable. It had flaws, and American pilots now knew exactly what they were. They knew what those flaws were and how to use them against the Akutan Zero. It wasn't to tactical doctrine that it made a difference. It was to aircraft design, especially to a fighter that was. When Koga crashed into the lies, work on the Grumman F6F Hellcat was already on the way. It would be the weapon that changed American tactical understanding into terrible results in battle. The story of how the Hellcat was made and how the Akutan Zero shaped its growth would be just as important as Sanders' test flights. The link between the two planes has been debated throughout history. Some say the Hellcat was built on the captured Zero, while others say the timeline doesn't make sense. That's not possible. The truth is somewhere between a story and the truth. Of simultaneous progress, fast information, and Grumman's ability to use what it had learned even as their fighter was going into production in January 1942. Beth Page works for Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island, New York. Leroy Grumman was sitting at his desk. He was looking over early plans for what would become the F6F Hellcat, and the numbers bothered him. The Navy needed to take the place of the F4F Wildcat, something faster and stronger to counter the news from the Pacific that the Japanese had better air power. Grumman's design team, led by Chief Jake Swerble and Bill Schwindler, 2 engineers, had made what was basically a bigger and stronger Wildcat. The plan looked good on paper, but Grumman was afraid it might not be enough. It was the beginning of 1942. Brought more and more scary news from the Pacific. Japanese Zeros were beating American pilots at every fight. Grumman's latest frontline fighter, the F4F Wildcat, was. Even though it was a strong, well-built plane, it wasn't good enough. Combat reports said the Zero could something much better than the Wildcat that can climb, turn, and arrange itself in almost every way. Was needed and needed right away. Grumman's first F6F was named the XF6F. One was designed to fit the right R260 whirling engine with 1,700 horsepower. This would make the new fighter stronger. A Pratt & Whitney R1830 with 1,200 horsepower gives it more power than the Wildcats. Grumman wasn't sure if it was a big enough improvement, though. The company had been working on the XF6F1 since mid-1941, with the official agreement made on June 30, 1941, almost a year earlier. Koga's Zero crashed in the Illusions. The design work moved quickly forward. Through early 1942, because the Navy needed them right away in Grumman's. There was a sense that the Pacific War would be won or lost in the air. Aeronautics worked closely with Grumman engineers and took into account what battle pilots who had just returned from the. On April 22, 1942, 6 weeks before the Battle of Midway and 7 weeks before the Battle of Midway, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare went to Grumman's Bethpage plant right before Koga crashed. O'Hare was just back from. He had defended the carrier Lexington against Japanese bombers during combat actions by himself. Met with Grumman experts to talk about how the F4F Wildcat did against the Zero, which earned him the Medal of Honor. His ideas were frightening. The Zero was faster than anything the U.S. had ever thought of. Estimated, went higher than seemed physically possible for its engine power, and could turn inside the Wildcat. O'Hare stressed that American pilots needed more power, a faster climb rate, and gave the pilot better vision. The day before the meeting with Grumman engineers, O'Hare had met President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the event where the Medal of Honor was given. When the president asked what a new Navy fighter should have, O'Hare gave a clear, memorable answer. A plane that will go up faster. Lieutenant Commander A.M. Jackson of the Bureau of Aeronautics is working. Jackson stressed mounting and worked closely with Grumman to make specific design changes based on combat experience. The seat is higher up in the fuselage, and the front of the fuselage slopes down a bit to reach the engine cowling. The pilot had a good view over the nose. He told the Grumman experts that it is impossible to hit them if you can't see them. These changes were made to the XF6F design before Koga's Zero was even made. Found. On April 26, 1942, 5 weeks before Koga's last trip, based on reports from combat, the Bureau of Aeronautics made a key choice that would shape the F6F's personality. The Pacific and O'Hare's suggestions, WWII told Grumman to put in a stronger engine in the second prototype of the XF6F. The Wright R260. The Pratt & Whitney R28,000 was chosen instead. The Double Wasp has an 18-cylinder rotary engine that makes 2,000 horsepower. The VAF-4U Corsair and the Republic P-47 both had this engine. This version of Thunderbolt had 50% more power than the first one. XF6F, one design, so Grumman had to rethink. And making the F6F's frame stronger so it can handle the bigger engine. The engine position, cooling system, and structural parts all had to be changed because of the change. Aircraft. This meant that the schedule for development would be pushed back, but the speed gains would be worth it. Grumman thought that the new power plant would make things 25% better over the original design. The choice to change the engine was made by a number of factors coming together. At the same time, the R280 had been tested and shown to be stable. Pratt & Whitney could provide engines without the delays because they were already in production for other plane projects. Having trouble with the Wright R260 growth. Most importantly, fight. Reports said that small gains would not be enough. American fighters needed a huge step forward in performance to meet or beat the Zeros. The first XF6F1 prototype, which was still fitted with the correct R260 Cyclone engine, took its first flight. On June 26, 1942, with test pilot Bob Hall in charge. It had been 8 days since Koga crashed in the Aleutians and 6 weeks since the Zero. It was found. The prototype worked well and showed good handling. It had good qualities and no major flaws, but how well it worked with the 1,700 horsepower Cyclone proved Grumman's. There were worries that more power was needed. The second prototype, which was named XF6F3, with the 2,000 horsepower R2800 Double Wasp, took its first flight on July 30, 1942. This was 20 days after the Akutan Zero was found, but 2 months before it was used. The XF6F3S would be fixed up so they could fly again and tested. The performance was better than expected. The extra power changed the design, giving it the ability to climb but the Hellcat did not get the speed it needed to fight with the Zero on an equal level. Don't stop there. During the summer of 1942, Grumman researchers kept improving the design. Based on current battle reports and information from the Pacific, the Akutan Zero arrived in San Diego in the middle of as early as August. The Bureau of Aeronautics and Grumman started getting detailed technical details. Even though the plane hadn't flown yet, a close look at it showed important details about its build, weight, and other features. Weapons and design. This intelligence reached a turning point in theory. At this point in the development of the F6F, the general design was set, and the engine. Even though the design had been chosen and the first prototypes had been flown, production had not yet started, so changes could still be made. Incorporated pretty quickly, engineers at Grumman looked at the Zero data with great interest and were looking for ways to make sure their fighter could not only match, but also beat the Japanese. What the plane could do. The Zero weighed between 5,300 and 6,100 pounds. Full of fuel, the F6F would weigh over 12,000 pounds. This huge weight penalty, it was more than twice as heavy as the Zero, had to be made up for by more power and clever design. Grumman's ideas were very different from the Japanese approach. While the Zero gave up speed for protection, the F6F, Roy Grumman, the father of the company, made a very important choice. He decided that Grumman could match or beat the Zero in most ways after looking at the Zero statistics. The F6F would have strong armor for the pilots, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a strong fuselage frame. The R-28,000 engine's extra strength helped make up for the extra weight. This choice changed everything. That came after. The F6F would be built to be tough and able to handle war. The damage would be enough to kill a Zero, and the pilot would be safe with an armor plate behind the seat and an airbag. It would have a windshield and fuel tanks that could seal themselves so they wouldn't catch fire when they were hit. There are multiple backup systems and a strong structure that can handle hard ship landings and damage from battle. The loss would be made up for by raw power and smart design that made the most of the performance that was available. Reports from battle with the Akutan Zero and Sanders test flights in September and October had an effect. Some design choices were made as the F6F got closer to production. The wings of the F6F were made to go fast, so they had a different design for the airfoil and control surface than the Wildcat. The ailerons were electrically boosted and covered in metal, which gave the pilot full control at all speeds. Fixed the problems Sanders found with the Zero's high-speed wing. The F6F would be able to. The F6F can roll well at speeds where the Zero's controls would have locked up. The Zero had a float-type carburetor, but this one had a pressure carburetor instead. This made sure the engine would run smoothly. Keep going at a negative speed, which gets rid of the weakness Sanders used in his test. Trips. An F6F pilot could dive away from a Zero that was coming after him without his engine, giving up at the most important time. The F6F construction was made to handle 9G, positive and negative acceleration of 6G, which is much higher than the Zero structure. This meant that F6F pilots could make bold moves without worrying about. The weapons package was expanded, and Zeros that tried to follow would risk breaking up because the structure would fail. In comparison to the Wildcats, 4 had up to 650 caliber machine guns. Give you the choice between two 20mm weapons and 450 caliber guns. Short bursts of firepower could destroy the Zero, which was not very well built, while the F6F's armored frame could take a lot of damage. Return fire. With the pilot up, visibility from the cockpit was great. This fixed Jackson's problem by giving him a good view in every direction. Stressed that pilots couldn't shoot at things they couldn't see. The design took what was learned from the THARP weave and other defense moves, knowing that being seen was important for mutual support between friends. On October 3, 1942, the first F6F-3 was put into production. Made its first flight only 2 weeks after Sanders finished his first test. There were flights in the Akutan Zero, and the time wasn't a mistake. Production had already begun, been purposely put off until engineers could add the newest information. The idea that the F6F was made based on the Akutan Zero is clearly not true, since the design was made before Koga's crash, and the choice to change the engine happened before the Zero was even found. Gave Grumman the information it needed to improve the F6F's final design. Learn from the captured planes and use what they learned in combat exercises before production sped up. F6F-3s that were made started showing up in fleet groups in early 1943. In February 1943, Fighting Squadron 9 got the first Hellcats that could be used, going to train and work up on the carrier Essex. The pilot's reply to the new fighter was excited. After months of fighting in F4F Wildcats and suffering against better opponents, Japanese planes, the F6F seemed like a huge step forward in terms of what it could do. It went faster, went up better, had more firepower, better vision, and felt solid in a way that the Wildcat never did. Pilots quickly learned that the F6F was surprisingly simple to fly. Knowing that it would be flown by pilots who were still learning, Grumman made it so that they could do it. During the war, that growth would bring a lot of new pilots into the fleet. The F6F didn't have any bad habits or tricks that could kill an unwary pilot. It was safe, predictable, and didn't mind when you made mistakes. Landing on a carrier, which is the hardest part of military aviation, was easy for the Hellcat. Strong landing gear withstood hard hits that would have brought down weaker planes. Pilots could see their approach very well, and the controls stayed sensitive even when visibility was low. Carriers need to reach certain speeds. Production sped up with amazing. For speed, Grumman built a new plant at Bethpage just for making the F6F. The first plane rolled off the line before the plant buildings were even finished. In 1944, Grumman made 644 planes in 1 month, which was the highest number of planes ever made. 1 Hellcat per hour, which was a record for making planes that has never been broken. The size was unbelievable. Each F6F needed about 20,000 separate parts from more than 300 suppliers. The Pratt & Whitney engines were built, manufactured in 3 different plants, and sent to Bethpage to be set up. Grumman oversaw this industrial project. People were amazed by how well the symphony was played. A lot of the credit goes to Jake Swerbel, Grumman's production manager. Genius who set up the supply chain and processes in a way that had never been seen before. Many of the people who worked at Grumman had never built an airplane before, but they made the best ship fighter of all time. After the first flight in October 1942 and until the end of the war, from April 1944 to November 1945, or about 37 months, Grumman would. A single plant can make 12,275 F6F Hellcats. Complex. The F6F first flew in battle on August 31, 1943. 15 months after the Akutan Zero was found and 11 months after Sanders' first test flight. Fighter squadrons planes, with 5 and 9 flying from carriers. The ships Yorktown and Independence struck Marcus Island as part of a raid by carriers. The plan was a huge success. The Japanese fighters couldn't get into the air, and many of them were destroyed on the ground. 2 Hellcats were shot down by enemy planes on the ground, but in air-to-air combat. In battle, the F6F showed right away that it was better. Over the next few months, the F6F continued to improve. The standard fighter on American fleet carriers, slowly taking the place of the F4F Wildcat on the big ships. Wildcats kept working on smaller escort carriers until early 1944, when the Hellcats were used by 15 carrier fighter units and were quickly becoming the most important American naval fighter in the world. Pacific. The lessons learned from the Akutan Zero were used into every part of running an F6F. Pilots were taught to avoid slow speeds, changing fights unless they had a big edge in height or numbers. Instead, F6F doctrine stressed fast slashing moves that came from diving height to gain speed, shooting once, and then zooming back up to height before the more maneuverable Zeros could react. The Thatche, which was made by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch's defense strategy, was used by all F6Fs before the Zero was even taken. When jumped by Zeros, F6F pilots flew in groups that helped each other, going back and forth between pairs so that any Zero chasing one F6F would face head-on fire from the other right away. This strategy stopped the Zero's attack, giving them the upper hand by making the Japanese pilot choose between breaking off or going head-on with them. The F6F had better defenses and weapons, so it won. Pilots were taught to use their speed to their advantage, and the power to decide how the battle would go. If the tactical situation backed the F6F, engage. If not, use your faster speed to withdraw, move, and attack. From an edge, the F6F's fast climb rate let it get back up quickly. It was able to get away from bad situations quickly after diving strikes. November 23rd, it could roam for longer periods of time and chase fleeing enemies farther than Zeros could catch up. In 1943, F6F Hellcats from the Gilbert Islands. Carrier Essex fought Japanese Zero fighters over Tarawa in the first big test of the new naval fleet. Fighter against Japan's best. 30 Zeros rose to block the American attack. And then there was a dogfight in the sky over the invasion beaches. When the smoke cleared, American pilots said they had shot down 30 Japanese planes for the loss of a single F6F. The Battle of Tarawa showed what the F6F was meant to do. Accomplish. Many of the American pilots were still pretty new to the job. Experienced Japanese pilots flying Zeros and completely destroyed them. Good performance, smart strategies based on knowing the Zer's flaws, and a lot of training had made an formula that couldn't be beat. The outcome of the fight shocked both the American and Japanese leaders. Americans, it proved that the F6F was a good design and that the tactics ideas that came from studying the Akutan Zero were right. It showed the Japanese that American planes had caught up to and surpassed the Zero's skills. There was no longer a time when Japan had better air power, but Tarawa was just the start. The F6F would show its worth in all big battles in the Pacific over the next 20 months, collecting the most important battles. Record of any American soldier in World War II. On June 19, 1944, it is in the Philippine Sea, west of the Marana Islands. 7 large fleet carriers in the United States, 15 American aircraft ships, and the biggest Japanese fleet was ready to face 8 light carriers from Task Force 58. Since the Battle of Midway 2 years ago, the carrier air force has been put together. Japan had 9 aircraft carriers and sent wave after wave of planes to attack and destroy the American invasion force. Attack on Saipan. What happened next was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot and was the most one-sided air fight in the history of the Navy. The first Japanese attack, in '69, lost 42 planes before they got to the American force. The last 27 planes made it to safety. That got through to the ships, but didn't do anything because they were facing a storm of anti-aircraft fire and swarming. 107 Japanese planes made up the second wave. Japanese carriers were being hit by enemy planes before they could even attack. Systematic destruction. During the day, Japanese carriers fired 370 repeated attacks, but only 130 came back. The F6F Hellcats, flying. Most of the Japanese attack groups that were being tracked by a combat air patrol over the American fleet were shot down. The United States lost 23 to 30 planes, and many of their pilots had to be saved. Japan's strategy was completely destroyed by the attack on the seas. The groups that worked hard to rebuild after the losses at Midway were wiped out. The veteran pilots who had taught the new generation were no longer alive. The planes that had been saved for the decisive fight was over, and Japan's naval aviation would never be the same after the losses on this one day. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the F-6F showed that it was working at its best. Its long life made it possible for battle air patrols to continue over the fleet. The F-6FS could catch incoming strikes at the best height thanks to its fast climb rate. Its speed let it go after Japanese planes that were trying to get away. Its firepower and, because it was better protected, the F-6F had a huge edge in any head-to-head battle. But perhaps most importantly, the F-6F was easy to control, so even people who weren't very good at the plane could be flown well by American pilots in battle. By the middle of 1944, the U.S. was making pilots a lot faster than Japan, and the F-6F gave these new pilots the courage to go into battle. They were able to stay alive and do well, but Japanese pilots were not, getting less and less training as fuel ran out and instructors were killed off. By late 1944, Japanese pilots went into battle with only about a third of the flying hours that American pilots had. The difference in price and the F-6F's better technology led to a death spiral for Japanese air travel. Each battle cost Japan irreplaceable. American losses were quickly made up for by a training system that was turning out thousands of new pilots every year. The F-6F's role in the American win went beyond aerial battle. The plane was changed into many different types of vehicles, different versions that met different military needs. The F-6F, 3N, and F-6F, 5N fighter versions had radar on board, a pod on the left wing, which let them stop Japanese night bombing raids. The radar cut down on enemy ships. While F-6F night fighters didn't reach their top speed as quickly, night fighter pilots thought the ability to do so was worth the trade-off. Having a great deal of success against Japanese night raiders, shooting down bombers that had struck without being caught in the dark. The F-6F, 3P, and F-6F, 5P photographic surveillance versions got rid of the guns and put cameras in their place. They were used for important reconnaissance missions over enemy land because of their speed and range, which let them go deep into Japanese-held areas, take pictures of targets, and get away before interceptors could react. Later F-6 and F-5 versions were changed so that it can carry 2,000-pound bombs on a centerline rack and rocket lines under the wings, which turned the fighter into a very good fighter bomber. Marines and soldiers fighting with F-6Fs that were armed with bombs and rockets got deadly close air support, attacking Japanese bunkers, artillery positions, and troop formations with great accuracy as they went across Pacific Islands. That guns just couldn't beat. By the end of World War II, F-6F Hellcats. The plane had collected numbers that are still not matched by any other American fighter, destroying 5,163 enemy airplanes in air combat in the Pacific by the U.S. Navy and Marines Corps pilots, and another 60 planes were shot down in other areas. Adding the British Royal Navy fleet brings the number to 5,223. Air Arm wins. Only 270 F6Fs were lost in air-to-air battle, which means that against Japanese Zeros, giving them an overall kill-to-loss score of 19-1. In particular, the ratio was 13-1. These numbers showed the total. The effect of better aircraft performance, good tactical doctrine drawn from learning the Akutan Zero, and American pilots getting better while the Japanese got weaker. Between 305 and 307, the Navy Hellcat made more fighter kills than any other Allied plane during World War II. With some small changes, pilots became aces after 5 or more wins. Counts based on how shared kills were given credit. Commander David, the Navy's best pilot. Michel won all 34 of his games while flying an F6FS. The Hellcat was so good in battle that Japanese pilots in the late war came up with what Americans call intelligence, known as zero fatigue. This was an admission that engaging F6FS was probably going to kill you. Japanese pilots dodged battle more and more, diving away or running into the clouds instead of fighting. Being mentally stronger was just as important as being technically better, because it let American carrier groups move almost without being stopped by Japanese air defenses. And didn't work. It was very different from early war combat. In 1942, American pilots had left from Zeros as much as possible. By 1945, Japanese pilots were running away from Hellcats. The change was complete. The Akutan Zeros part in. This change is hard to measure, but it is clear that it is important. The captured airplane gave the first specific information about what the Zero could and couldn't do. During Sanders' test flights, certain flaws were found that could be used strategically. Impacted the F6F design decisions at a critical time when changes could still be made. Most importantly, the Japanese fighter's mystery was broken by Akutan Zero, which showed it wasn't unbeatable. Rather an airplane with certain skills and weaknesses. When the F6F Hellcat and the Akutan Zero's tactical skills were put together, they worked well together. Changed the way American military aircraft flew. The F6F wasn't made because of it was based on information from the captured airplane and was improved from the Akutan Zero. Used were not made by looking at the Zero. Instead, Sanders' test flights proved them to be correct and official. After some research, the end result was a system of aircraft, tactics. Japanese aviation was overrun by training and industrial output. When the war was over, Japan had made about 10,500 Zeros, which were main fighter throughout the war. The U.S. made 12,275 in 37 months, along with thousands of F-4U Corsair and other fighters. The difference in production showed how strong America's industries were. But the difference in battle showed that the F6F was technically better in that it was used successfully in tactical doctrine. The Akutan Zero was destroyed in February 1945, an airplane crashed while taxiing for takeoff, but it was an accident during training instead of battle. Something went wrong with an SB-2C held diver dive bomber at Naval Air Station North Island and crashed into the stopped Zero, cutting the Japanese fighter into pieces with its propeller. William Leonard saved the Japanese fighter. They took a number of gauges from the wreck and gave them to the National Museum of the United States Navy. Small pieces were also kept at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and the Heritage Museum. The actual plane was, even though it was no longer around, the F6F lived on in every combat mission it flew and in every. As an American pilot who knew the Zero's flaws, every tactical handbook that included lessons learned from Sanders' test flights. Koga's body was first buried on Akutan Island. American Graves Registration Service teams took it out in 1947 and put it back on Adak Island, which is farther down the illusion chain. The Adak Cemetery was built in 1953. 236 bodies, possibly including Koga's, were found and returned after being dug up. The young pilot, who died at age 19, was buried in Japan without knowing it. Japan's loss was helped by his perfectly preserved planes, which revealed secrets that would doom thousands of his soldiers. Fellow countrymen, the historical argument about how important the Akutan Zero was continues. Some historians say it was the most important piece of intelligence collected during the Pacific War, more useful than code-breaking or any other source. Others say that the Americans were always going to win, and the Zeros. The capture only sped up trends that were already happening. Japanese historians, and air defense experts. Important General Masatake Okumiya, who was in charge of the air staff during most of the important battles fought on Pacific carriers, said that getting the Akutan Zero was just as bad as Japan losing Midway. The fact that secrets were leaked to American experts and test pilots was a terrible intelligence failure whose the effects of the recovered Zero were felt for the rest of the war. Fighter ace William Leonard called it a Marine ace Kenneth Walsh said it was a gem that revealed many secrets at a time when they were needed most. Koga Zero's intelligence saved his life more than once, and his tactical understanding helped him survive early encounters that could have been deadly. The truth probably has parts of all of these stories. From these points of view, the Akutan Zero wasn't the only one to blame for American victory depended on many things, including the ability to build factories, break codes, fight in submarines, and more. It was an important piece of the puzzle that came at just the right time to change decisions about how planes are designed, creating new tactical strategy. The F-6F would still fly without the Akutan Zero. Would have been a great fighter, but American industry would still have been able to beat Japan's in terms of production, and the U.S. would have won. Most likely, the goal would have been reached, but it might have taken longer, cost more American lives, and involved more people. There was less confidence about how to beat the Zero's abilities. The 19-to-1 kill ratio showed the superior aircraft design that is the result of many things coming together perfectly. Put both efficiency and pilot safety first. Tactical doctrine came from studying what the enemy could do and how weak they were. Training that got pilots ready for real battle. And most importantly, detailed intelligence that led to output that ensured numerical superiority. About the enemy's main weapon from a single, almost whole example that was found by accident in the Aleutian. American soldiers who flew F6F Hellcats during the war got together at. Many of them were F6F and got together at different meetings in the decades after World War II. Hellcat pilots who used to rule the skies over the Pacific are now talking about their memories and remembering those who died. Friends, the speakers at these events kept talking about the Akutan Zero and how smart it was. They talked about how knowing the Zero's flaws had given them faith in, and they talked about how to use the high-speed dive and hard right roll method that Sanders had found. Veterans talked about how the F-6F's design was based on what was learned from the captured Japanese fighter. Talked about the same thing over and over. The Zero was unbeatable. One former fighter ace said, "We believed it because we had seen what it could do to our planes in early. At first, we learned about fighting from the plane we caught in Alaska. It was bad for its engine to stop when it was going downhill, so it couldn't roll at high speeds. It became clear that it was weak and would burn if hit. It was no longer unbeatable. It was just another thing in the world. We had a plane that we could beat if we were smart about how we flew. The F-6F gave us this chance. The F-6F gave us the knowledge, and together they helped us win." The Hellcat stayed in active service until the end of World War II, and the F-4U slowly replaced it. Corsair, as the ship landing problems with that plane were fixed. By the end of the war, jets and more powerful propeller fighters had quickly taken the place of Hellcats in the fleet. Some were sent to reserve squadrons and stayed there until the early 1950s. Others were turned into target drones or thrown away. In 1954, only 9 years after the war finished, the last Navy Hellcat was taken out of service. The speed with which they became obsolete showed how quickly aircraft technology changed during and after World War II. In 1943, planes that were cutting edge were hopelessly out of date by 1954. Jets that went twice as fast and climbed 3 times as fast, but the Hellcat had a good record in battle. Made sure it would never be forgotten. Across the United States, museums show surviving F-6Fs, many of which have been restored to flying state. People at air shows are amazed as old Hellcats perform. Their unique sound and shape bring to mind a time when American Navy aviation was the best thanks to a combination of brilliant tech and smart military strategy. There are still 70 F-6F Hellcats in museums and private collections around the world. 7 are still able to fly. They are all based in the United States and are regularly flown at air. There are shows and events to remember. Each flight is a memory of the 12,000. The 34,000 pilots who flew Grumman's planes in battle, and the 5,000 enemy soldiers who were killed. They shot down many planes, and the Akutan Zero only lives on in legends. Pieces of it can be found in museums and in the thousands of pages of test reports and intelligence studies that have been stored in the National Archives, but it had a much bigger effect on the Pacific War than it was there. American success was helped by planes that were caught by accident, tested for a few months, and then destroyed in an accident. Win in ways that are hard to quantify, but can't be ruled out. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders was the test pilot who flew the Akutan Zero for the first time. He lived to see the F6Fs. He continued to serve in different aviation test and review roles. He played important parts during the war and helped with the development of many types of aircraft. After the war, he worked After leaving the Navy, he worked in the aerospace business. His experience testing airplanes was very helpful in the fast-paced. After World War II, there was a lot of progress in technology. He died in the 1970s. Saw the total change in naval aviation from fighters with propellers to jets that can fly faster than sound. Sanders rarely talked about his part in testing the Akutan Zero in public because he saw it as just one of his jobs. He was one of many people who worked in Navy aviation, but those who served with him knew who he was, how important his job was. His careful test flights, in-depth reports, and the results of the analyses had directly affected American tactical doctrine and indirectly affected choices about the design of the F6F. The bigger lesson from this is that he was a quiet professional who did a great job when it meant the most. The story of the Akutan Zero and F6F Hellcat goes beyond World War II. The military spends a lot of money on gathering information, technical analysis, and threat assessments because the Akutan Zero case showed how useful it can be to know a lot about what the enemy can do. Enemy planes, every spy who gives technical details, and every source of information that shows enemy weaknesses could be another Akutan Zero, a key that opens tactics, and having technological benefits, knowing what your enemy can do, and limitations can make the difference between winning and losing. When properly examined and used, a piece of hardware can have an effect on how weapon systems are designed and how they are made, strategies, and how fights turned out. The Akutan Zero got to exactly the Sanders test flights were at a time when they could affect the development of the F6F. It showed pilots their flaws just when they needed to feel confident to face the Zero. The practical lessons were sent out when training programs could use them. If they had been sent out a year earlier or later, the effect might have been. The timing was right, and America took full advantage of it. The Zero in 1942 was probably the best ship fighter battle in history, better in many ways than anything the United States had. But America's ability to make tens of thousands of F6Fs, train tens of thousands of pilots, and keep fighting. Being able to work across an ocean gave it benefits that the Zero's superior technology could not match. Quality is important, but quantity also has its own value, especially when mixed with tactical knowledge. Good ideas. The F6F Hellcat and the Akutan Zero show two sides of this. The Hellcat was the result of American engineering and economic power, skill, and putting together tactical information. Fortune gave the Akutan Zero to American intelligence, a lucky break that gave them important knowledge about what the enemy could do. When put together, they were unbeatable, and American Navy aviation went from being defensive to offensive. From being behind in early 1942 to being completely in charge by mid-1944. The young Japanese pilot who died in an Aleutian bog had no idea that his perfectly kept plane would be found by someone else. His wingmen hoped he would live, but were unable to help his country lose. Have known that their lack of courage in not destroying his plane would put thousands of their fellow soldiers in danger. The American salvage teams working hard in that Alaskan marsh had no idea they were finding the key to the air superiority in the Pacific. And Eddie Sanders, driving the cab that caught 04, its first flight in the United States, couldn't have known how much his test flights would change a fighter that would have helped win the war, but that's how history is made. When chance and when planning and luck meet, when luck favors those who are ready to take advantage of it, when one piece of information comes at just the right time to change things in ways that aren't obvious at first. One of a kind, the Akutan Zero was a moment, and the F6F Hellcat was its heritage. Stolen planes and a skilled test pilot. There was a time when Intelligence, design, and tactical strategy all came together to make a weapon system with a 19-to-1 kill ratio. Wiped out Japanese planes over the Pacific. The change in American. The rise of naval aviation from a minor force to a major one was made possible by the coming together of industrial power, engineering, excellence, smart people, skilled pilots, and understanding. The Akutan Zero showed that the Japanese fighters who looked unbeatable had flaws that could be used against them. The F6F Hellcat was made and used to take full advantage of those flaws. When American F6F Hellcat pilots went into battle, they brought with them They didn't just have better technology, they also knew more about the Zeros. Because Eddie Sanders found their flaws, they knew how to take advantage of those weaknesses because Sanders' test flights had changed the tactical strategy, and they knew it. They could win because hard facts from the captured Japanese had broken down the myth that they were unbeatable. It was natural that the 19-to-1 kill ratio would happen, which shows what can be reached when luck gives you a chance and skill turns that chance into a huge edge. The story of how a test pilot's captured Zero turned into an F-6 fighter jet, turned into a 19-to-1 killing machine shows that bravery and weapons aren't the only things that decide a war. The F-6F has intelligence, the ability to change, and the ability to learn from the enemy. The Hellcat and the Akutan Zero wrote a part of aircraft history that, even after 8 decades, it still has an impact. It shows that sometimes the biggest wins don't come from destroying things, but by getting understand.